Hi little berries, this is Eryberrie here now. Like with my last video, this is the second attempt at making this, but this time it's because I ran into some audio issues. I did the whole video, I thought, great, I'll go and edit it. Yeah. So I'm having to use different software to record my audio. I've got my trusty Snowball, a bit of a different setting because I have just also filmed a vlog at which I had to actually be at my PC, not with my laptop in the bedroom, that lovely wardrobe you know and love so much. This particular case that I am covering today, in my opinion, hasn't had enough coverage. I couldn't really find a huge amount online about it. There is a documentary that is on YouTube, which was run in the UK about 15 years ago. And I will put a link in the description below, and probably above as well. It's called Love You to Death, and there's very little by way of documentary, or the only information that I could also find was either from just Wikipedia or from some journals, newspaper cuttings, etc. But overall, it's one of the most difficult ones to research because there isn't a lot about it. And I can't find any other true crime vlogger that's covered it. So I thought I'd give this one a bit more illumination, for lack of a better term, because it's a very good example as to why life should mean life, and it will become more apparent as we go on. This is the case of Rachel Margaret McLean. Rachel Margaret McLean was a 19-year-old woman born in Blackpool, England. She moved to Oxford in 1989 to study English language at St Hilda's College. She lived with two other housemates in a shared accommodation, and she was described by many people as being very bubbly, lively, and very kind. She used to do a lot of volunteer work. She was described by her sixth form English literature tutor as a splendid student. It was clear that she'd go very, very far. She was very, very keen on learning. At the time of the events that happened around this case, she was just finishing her second year at university. In August 1990, Rachel celebrated her 19th birthday in her hometown of Blackpool, and it was there at the pub at which she was celebrating where she met a man called John Mark Tanner. John was a 22-year-old man who was studying at university in Nottingham, and he was doing some work in Blackpool, which is how they met. John was originally born in Hampshire in this country in the UK, but his parents and him moved to New Zealand when he was a child. He often used to emigrate between the UK and New Zealand, and of course at the time of this particular case, he was living again in the UK. They hit it off straight away. John had a kind of edge that really attracted Rachel. He, the way he dressed, he was inspired by rock music. He had long hair, leather jackets, and Rachel was into rock music. He was very sociable, very well liked, and they very, very quickly formed a very intense relationship, with Rachel returning to Oxford in September, and of course John would be in Nottingham studying. It was a very long distance relationship. They saw each other when they could, mostly at weekends, and they would obviously use the train to travel to and from one of those homes. Their main method of communication, though, because of course this was before social media and before many people had mobile phones, they used to write each other letters, and they would often phone each other. Their relationship was extremely intense. They adored each other, they loved each other. The letters they wrote to each other were very emotionally charged. But John seemed to be obsessed with Rachel. He would phone her a lot. He would check up on her, who she was with, what she was wearing, where she was, what time she'd be back, that she had to phone as soon as she got back home. And he would often call and then ask her housemates what she was wearing, who she was going with, what she was doing. It became a bit too intense for Rachel. She felt smothered. She felt possessed, and they would often argue on the phone. But despite all of these arguments, despite all this intensiveness, their relationship continued nonetheless, and 8 months after meeting they became engaged. On the 13th of April 1991, John Tanner travelled from Nottingham to Oxford to spend the bank holiday weekend with Rachel. He watched football while she studied in the living room. The next day, John returned to Nottinghamshire, and Rachel was due to start her end-of-year exams within literally just just a couple of days. But she did not turn up for her exams. After a day or two, her housemates realised that she actually hadn't been home for quite some time, and therefore the police were called. The house was searched thoroughly, but there was no sign of Rachel. There was no sign of where she may have gone. All of her belongings had remained there. There were searches of the woodlands, and even the local river had been dragged, but nothing had been found. The coverage from the media was huge. The media actually started to turn on John, believing that he had something to do with Rachel's disappearance. He believed he was being wrongly targeted just simply because of the way he was dressed, that he was an easy target for the press. Both Rachel's parents and John took part in a media press conference appealing for Rachel's safe return, or at least some sort of contact to confirm that she was okay, even if she didn't want to come home. Whilst Rachel's mother and father were very anxious and very concerned about her well-being, John, who was naturally, he was a very jealous and possessive boyfriend, didn't seem to be too concerned that his girlfriend's whereabouts were unknown. Even if he wasn't concerned about her welfare, he wasn't talking about, who's she with? Has she run off with another man? At the end of the conference, the journalist actually asked him if anything had happened to Rachel from his doing. Now, I saw this on the documentary that when the question was put to him, he didn't react the same way that maybe you and I would react. It's like, how dare you imply that I've had anything to do with my girlfriend's disappearance? This has nothing to do with me, or whatever. He was very calm, very cool, and he looked down to his right, paused, shook his head, pressed his lips, and went, no, not to my knowledge. And then when they said, do you believe she's alive? And he said, well, in my heart of hearts, I do believe she's alive. He smirked. He showed there were no tears, there was no emotion, there was no desperation. And at one point he referred to her in the past tense. He even said that she did some things that he was not very happy with, maybe indicating that either she'd been unfaithful or that she participated in some activities that he didn't approve of. His friends were also becoming quite concerned about him, about the fact that he was just carrying on life as normal. When he was back up in Nottingham, he was playing football, which he loved doing. He was going to the pub and socialising. He became very friendly with the police, who tried to give him the impression that they were supporting him and being friendly with him, but actually what they were doing was they were observing him, trying to pick up on the things he said, his body language. But because of how he conducted himself in this conference, the press were more determined than ever that this man had something to do with Rachel's disappearance. Despite all of this, there was no evidence whatsoever against him. There was no forensic evidence, there was no sign of Rachel, there was no body, so they had to try and think of other ways in which they could possibly either try and find Rachel, whether or not she was alive, or something else that might be able to lead to an arrest, so at least they could question him as a suspect. John told the police that he kissed Rachel goodbye at Oxford Station at 6:20 on the 14th of April 1991. And in order to try and jog people's memories like they normally do, a reconstruction was staged. John played himself and a police officer played Rachel. And one thing that also struck the police as odd was that a couple of days after Rachel had gone missing, the housemates found a letter that had been posted to Rachel after she'd gone missing. And it had been from John, but the wording of the letter was very, very strange. Within the letter, John mentions that when he and Rachel departed at Oxford Station, that Rachel had been given a lift by another man, a man who apparently looked quite like him, but a man that he didn't know, a stranger. He became known as the long-haired stranger. Now, as well as his conduct in the press conference, it seemed very strange that he'd be happy for his girlfriend to go off with someone he didn't know, saying it was nice of this person to have given her a lift. So when he did the reconstruction, there was a man playing this long-haired stranger, but nobody came forward to say that they'd seen this long-haired stranger. Nobody came forward to say that they were this person, and they couldn't trace who Rachel may have known who looked like John. This particular reconstruction didn't work the way that John Tanner wanted it to. It actually was the beginning of his downfall. When this was televised, 2 people actually remembered seeing John at Oxford Station, but they remember seeing him alone. And one particular woman called Jane Wynne Jones, she was watching the reconstruction and then remembered that she had actually sat next to him at Oxford Station on the bench at the platform. She remembered that he seemed to be very fidgety, very anxious, and he was constantly fiddling about with a holdall bag that he had. He'd actually got out a pad and a pen and began to write a letter. John had claimed to have written that letter on the train, but he hadn't. He'd written it on the platform. Another thing was that John said that he and Rachel had, after leaving her house to go to the station, they caught the bus to the station, and he confirmed the stop at which they got on, etc. But the bus actually kept a record of exactly how many tickets were sold, to which destinations, at all the stops they had. And when the information about that particular stop was found, it was actually discovered that only one ticket had been issued, not two. The police still needed more information, and for some reason they believed that the house, even though they had searched the house and been there so many times, must hold some clue. So they looked into the history of the houses in that area and found that they had actually been underpinned. Now, underpinning is when the foundations of a house are either not strong enough, or they've been damaged, or they're very old, they don't conform to the standard, or something sudden has happened like a quake or even subsidence, where they strengthen the foundations of a property to ensure it doesn't move anymore. This can sometimes result in air spaces and cavities under a property. When the police went along there, they decided to look for these cavities. They opened a cupboard under the stairs and moved some floorboards, and indeed there was some airspace there. They moved along a bit further to where an area was situated just below Rachel's bedroom, and it was there that they found her body. The autopsy confirmed that Rachel had died of strangulation, and because it had been very cold, it had been 18 days since she disappeared, her body hadn't really decomposed, so the forensics were actually able to find quite a bit of information about how she had died. And there was evidence that a ligature had been used. Very, very quickly, the police in Nottingham were notified. John was found at a pub that day, and he was arrested for Rachel's murder. The problem was, though, John Tanner didn't want to talk. He was completely silent. The police tried to get anything they could out of him. They even tried to talk to him about things not to do with Rachel, but he would not speak. They went away for a break, came back, and again, he would not talk. Eventually, he did say something, but not about Rachel. He just said that he wanted to talk to his lawyer. It was at this point that he broke down, and under the supervision of his lawyer, he told his story. After the football had ended, when they were having dinner, Rachel had said to him that she wanted to have a word with him, and she then confessed to having slept with other men or having seen someone else, although it's been more or less confirmed since then that that was not the case. There was nobody else in the picture whatsoever. That he became extremely angry, and the next thing he realised that his hands were around her throat, and he hadn't realised he'd killed her until her body went limp in his arms, and he didn't know what to do, so he hid her under the floorboards. 7 months later, the case went to trial, and even though John had killed Rachel, he had confessed that he killed her, he still pleaded not guilty to murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility because of the circumstances. The police speculate that he was doing that just to save his own skin, knowing that he'd go down, but he wanted to minimise his sentence to see if he could get manslaughter. John went back to being very cold and calculating, very selfish and very self-centered in answering his questions, talking about how, he was the victim in all of this, and it was really hard for him. He said that he'd used his hands to strangle Rachel. However, as I said earlier, the autopsy showed that a ligature had been used, and it was then discovered that what he'd done is, after he'd strangled her with his hands, most likely when she was unconscious, he had forced her face down, got a tea towel out of the kitchen, and finished the job. Therefore, this was outright murder and not accidental death, as well as the fact that he dragged her body to the opening of the cavity underneath the stairs, and then pushed her body all the way under the floorboards to just beneath her bedroom, and then carried on life as if nothing had happened. Even phoned the house at which she lived several times asking to speak to Rachel, wrote a letter to Rachel to make it look like he had done nothing. And yet his behaviour told a completely different story. The jury did not buy his not guilty plea, and he was found guilty on a majority of 10 to 12 of murder, sentenced to life. This is where I get onto the subject of a life should mean life. This man served just over 11 years and was released at the very beginning, I believe, of 2003. He returned to New Zealand, and I read in some journals that about a year ago he was convicted of assault. He'd been assaulting his partner for 6 months and is now in prison for serving a 2.5-year sentence. How much of that he will serve, I have no idea. If this had happened in the UK, because of his previous conviction in the UK, he would have had to have been returned to prison and serve the remainder of his original tariff, which was life. Prison is about rehabilitation, making sure that when people are released, 11 years isn't very long at all for murder. Not at all. That they're not a danger to the public, that they've been rehabilitated, that they've been that they're absolutely sure they won't reoffend, and yet over a 6-month period, he could have killed his new partner, and I really hope they don't get back together after this, because he could do this again. And this is exactly why I'm a real advocate of life should mean life, for the safety of the public. It's bad enough that he put an end to Rachel's life, a woman who had her whole life ahead of her. She really wanted this degree, and it's really sad that she never got to fulfill that dream with something that she worked so hard for. But yeah, that's the end of this particular case. It's very, very sad, and I think we can learn a lot of lessons from this. If people are sentenced to life for murder, it should mean life. I hope wherever you are well, and please subscribe. That will really, really help me out. And also please check out my main channel as well. I will put a link below. I have done 2 other videos before this on the murder of Leslie Molseed and the murder of Yara Gambarazio. I will be doing a lot more in the future, and if you've got a case for me, if you want to suggest something, hit me up on Twitter. I've also got a Facebook group, a Facebook page for this channel, or comment below. I'll do my best to research them. I can't do every single case, but I'll try and do as many as I possibly can. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye, goodbye, goodbye.